As I said before, I had some very early memories. I know it is rare, but I have known other people who had memories before the age of 3 also. They're fragmented like I have a memory of chicks. Later it turns out that my mother got colored chicks for Easter. Maybe her point was to spoil me, but for a woman and a small girl living in a basement apartment, it was indicative of her decision-making. There was another part of me from the time that I was small, that was adventurous. I watched my own son as he was growing, and I think their very small children have no sense of safety. While we lived with my grandmother, one of the places we stayed was on the train tracks. Remember, I'm 5 or under. I loved the trains because they were about going places and seeing things. I also liked the idea that the train tracks were really close to the back door stoop. So one day the train was coming, so I thought it would be a good idea to stand on the stoop out the back door, which was approximately 5 feet from the tracks. I pressed myself against the indent of the door so I could feel the wind blow by as the train raced by me. The door opened and my mother pulled me inside quickly and was horrified. To me it felt like flying. It reminded me of the risks I seen my son take when he was small. I had a thing for loving to get way up high, on top of things. I did that on the jungle gym as soon as I could crawl up there. And I loved being in water. Every fountain, every body of water I would get in and float. The water frightened my mother as she had a horrible experience with it. Her brothers threw her into the pond, trying to teach her to swim. She sank and later developed a phobia. When I was small, life felt like an adventure. Even the hunger and the independence were incorporated into that. There was this movie I saw very young. It was called Pollyanna. Pollyanna was a girl that lived in an orphanage, and the nuns often found her optimism irritating. She found a way to be grateful no matter the circumstances. I found it inspirational and adopted it into my childhood. I would walk around saying what I was grateful for. I am not sure it came out that way to the adults, but the movie gave me a philosophy for perspective. I loved movies and the television very early on. They were my companions and babysitters throughout childhood. My mother Maggie and our family lived on government welfare. Sometimes we would get these food subsidies, like the big blocks of government cheese. Who doesn't like that as a kid? As the world moved on to the 1980s, women went to work. I often wondered why my mother took limited or no steps toward working and relied on the very agencies that took her original 4 children away. I think there was a hopelessness that is the best she would do in life. There were all kinds of government programs offering schooling and job help, and she never took advantage of them. She found other ways to cope with life. Sometimes it was men, and sometimes it was moving, reinventing herself with sad tales of hardship. My first grade and those early years were not our worst. She often went from a depressive state to a childlike optimism herself. She did not smoke or drink alcohol. She was raised very religiously. So, the difficulties of my mother that passed to me were of trauma, repetitive trauma. These are my observations and opinions only. I think if you are not careful, you pass on trauma to your children. I worked really hard to do better with my son, and I did. Yet sometimes I can see his choices that seem like my trauma. Overthinking is one of them. When we moved into Portland, Oregon, Debbie, Maggie, and I lived in a Victorian house in the northwest part of town. We lived on Northwest Glisson Street, just above 21st. It is Nob Hill now, and the streets from Burnside East are alphabetical. When I was a child, that was a handy thing to learn. I memorized everything as a kid. Since I walked around a lot, it kept me from being lost. The house had 2 apartments, one upstairs and one downstairs. We lived downstairs. The backyard was generous with a green yard to play in, a neighborhood full of people and children to play with. I learned to ride a bike on that block. Of course it was someone else's bike as we couldn't afford one. I taught myself and was so proud. Later that year I was hit by a car on that street. The car knocked me down as I crossed the street. I was so small, it went over my body, and I got a cut on the head, scraped knee, and a sprained ankle. That was all. I went to the hospital but was home by evening. The poor man was so upset he brought me 5 gallons of vanilla ice cream, my favorite. On that block there were men that sat at the corner. I only remember one by name. His name was Red, and he wore this black shirt with small white polka dots. There were always 2 or 3 of them there, and they were friendly, kind men who watched out for us and never a harm to me. They would meet there and talk and smoke among themselves. After watching them, I wanted to smoke a cigarette. I remember they discussed it and said, "You want to take a puff? You are going to be really sick if you do." I wanted to, so they let me take a puff, which I immediately choked on. I got so nauseous I pulled the ironing board out, climbed up and laid on my stomach all afternoon. I thought I was going to die. At 15, I would still pick up that habit. Portland has generous amounts of rain, which results in the growth of green grass, tall trees, and beautiful flowers. Cosmos and creeping buttercups being among my favorites. It was a time to lie in the grass and watch the clouds go by with my sister and the neighbor children. There are generous parks, like Washington Park. It was a forest in the city, and one of my favorite places. We would walk all over our neighborhood. I wasn't in school when we first lived in that house. I guess I was 5. Oregon at the time did not have free kindergarten. I did start 1st grade in that house though. I went to a school called Cooch School. Cooch School was just a few blocks away in Northwest Portland. Later, after my attendance, it changed to Metropolitan Learning Center, a Montessori-style school. It had a swimming pool in the basement. That's what I remember it for, that and the fact school opened my life up to a completely different world. I remember being so excited, I told my mother she could leave when I got into that classroom. She hovered a little and I might have hurt her feelings, but I couldn't wait. I loved to learn and was bright enough to feel confident while learned to read from my Dick and Jane primer. I sang often in that school and mostly I got away from my family. Back to Maggie, she was on the run from David, her second husband. He had family in Portland, so we were always careful where we went and being in hiding almost. In her defense, she had her own neglect and abuse after her father died young. She ran away from home at 14 due to neglect, physical and sexual abuse from her older brothers. Then went to live with her father's family in Ohio. My grandfather was a handyman that caught pneumonia at the beginning of the Depression when my mother was only 14 months old. In a rural Midwest state, he died leaving a wife and 5 children. They survived by farming, family help, and having chickens. My mother was the youngest, with 3 older brothers and a sister. So, there was already a pattern I would see repeated with her leaving home young. She was married 3 times and had children with 4 different men. My mother met a man later that year, Don Jones. She told me he was a writer. I learned a couple of things. First, that we were going to move to a house further away. And that we were poor. I had no concept of that before then. A little girl came to my birthday party, my 7th birthday party, and she said my furniture is nicer than yours. And I went and told my mother. I thought it was like, how could that be true? My mother would introduce a theme to my life I hated, and made sure not to repeat. It was, beggars can't be choosers. I had no concept of nice or not nice things or our place in the world. But the universe is an interesting thing, and as you go through grade school you start to figure out how the world views you. We lived with him in this great big house for the summer. I felt like we were rich. One day it ended. Maggie said he was going to hurt her, and we had to leave. She took Debbie and I on the city bus to a woman's shelter. The shelter locked us in at night, which frightened my mother so badly, we escaped down the fire escape in the middle of the night. Debbie fell down a couple of steps, while we tried to be quiet and leave. The city buses were running, so we caught a bus to the Greyhound station. We ended up on the coast in a small town called Astoria. Again, it turned out my mother was pregnant with her 3rd child, really her 7th, but I don't think we knew that at this time. Her story to people was that her husband David came to Portland and wanted to get back together. I was old enough now to know she was lying after living with Don Jones all summer. That was her new story about her new baby boy. It was the ending of my innocence with my mother.